So, blessings, good evening. We have a few questions that have come in tonight. The first of which is, Dear Luang Por, in regards to putting effort into mindfulness practice, is my understanding correct to say that when a person has achieved enlightenment, he or she does not need to be mindful all the time? The reason I ask is because in the suttas, the Buddha said that he established mindfulness in front of him. If the Buddha is already mindful at that time, why would he if the Buddha is already mindful all the time, why would he still want to set mindfulness up again? Well, there's a few places where the Buddha pointed out that an enlightened being does certain things that are still useful for others, setting an example for others. As you point out, an enlightened being is free from mental defilements. There's no more, they don't have any more greed, anger, delusion conditioning their mind, no more ignorance, no more kilesa. So the simile is that the enlightened being has reached the other shore, as it were. The Buddhist path, Magga, the Noble Eightfold Path, is compared with a raft, taking you across the ocean of suffering, or the river of suffering, to the other side. And when you reach the other side, you can leave the raft on the shore and walk up without the burden of carrying the raft, meaning you don't have to carry on practicing the Noble Eightfold Path because your mind is now free from greed, anger and delusion. But as a teacher, the Buddha, or a sāvaka, an enlightened sāvaka or disciple, student of the Buddha, they'll do many things that are not maybe necessary for themselves in their own practice, but are beneficial for, particularly for the Sangha, the ordained Sangha, but also for the laity in general. So, for example, the Buddha and the Arahants keep the Vinaya rules. They still follow the training rules, even though they're enlightened. And the Buddha praised this and said we have to do it. Or sometimes he'd ask someone, say like he'd ask Mahakassapa, why do you keep the training rules? He said, well, partly for their own training and then partly for future generations, as an example, to keep up the rules. Because we know if a teacher dispenses with all the rules, then it makes it harder for the student to keep them. Because they'll say, well, he doesn't keep them, I don't need to keep them. Even though the teacher may be enlightened, but the student is not enlightened, so then their determination to follow the training rules may be weakened a bit. So it's good to have that example, even though the teacher is enlightened. And the same with other practices such as samadhi, or sati, as you said, mindfulness, and then samadhi. The Buddha would still enter jhana, he'd still practice samadhi as in sustain or maintain states of jhana, states of samadhi. He still had great psychic ability and great knowledge of many different things. And you could say, well, the Buddha doesn't need to do that anymore, doesn't need to meditate anymore. But he called it a vihara Dhamma. It's just like a dwelling place that he doesn't need to purify his mind anymore as part of the path. He's already pure. But it's a dwelling place. You've got to put your mind somewhere while you're still alive. And he's no longer following defilement or being conditioned by defilements of greed, anger and delusion. So the Buddha will, you could call it the recreation or the pastime of the Buddha, is say if there's nothing else to do, well, he can just dwell in the peace of purity and energy of samadhi, such as jhana. And this has various purifying effects on the body, so it's good for mental and physical health. It can revitalize. It's a very pure state that supports other knowledges as well. You're coming out of jhana, the Buddha will survey the world, spread metta, see who needs to be taught. So it supports the abhinya, the special knowledges that can be developed through jhana. So the Buddha is not doing this for his own benefit anymore, in the sense he's already enlightened, but he'll still practice these things as an example, and because they're useful tools, as it were, for teaching others, helping others. And so they are mindful all the time, in the sense the mind is pure, awake. The Buddha or an enlightened being doesn't need mindfulness anymore, but they may practice meditation, walking meditation. Many teachers after enlightenment are still practicing walking meditation. It's good exercise, it's a good example for others. It's a good way to keep your mind occupied with a useful activity, for example, even though there's no longer a need to cultivate the path, because they're experiencing the fruit of the path, what we call arahata phala, all the time. So that's sort of answer. Next question. Dear Luang Por, I have been struggling a bit with feeling remorseful and agitated after having listened to music or watched or used entertainment. I think it's in relation to the 8 precepts and me approaching it and seeing it as a sin rather than a training rule. Have you any advice? It would be greatly appreciated. Well, obviously the term sin comes from other religions, this sense of original sin or sinful behavior, wrong, bad, evil behavior. And it's become a bit of a hang-up in kind of Western culture, which then when we come to practice Buddhism, we may bring some of those hang-ups, attachments, perceptions in with us, into the practice. So Buddhist morality or ethics centers around the practice of 5 precepts. And even if you're a monastic, your monastic training is still centered around the 5 precepts, but expanded out with many other rules. But the 5 precepts are the basic training in skillful intention to refrain from killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, malicious speech, and taking intoxicants which cloud the mind. The intention to refrain from all that is a training which is essential for realization of the Dhamma, for stabilizing the mind, freeing the mind from remorse, regret, and the mental agitation that comes when we don't follow the precepts. So it's also essential for the cultivation of mindfulness successfully and development of samadhi and developing the whole path, Noble Eightfold Path for the end of suffering. Then we have the 8 precepts which people will take on from time to time. If you're a lay person, you may go on retreat or stay in a monastery, or even at home you take on the 8 precepts for a day or many days or longer. But then maybe you stop keeping the 8 precepts and go back to keeping just the 5 precepts because you have work, you have other things you're doing, so it's not convenient or conditions are not supportive for keeping the 8 precepts. And you have to get used to that dynamic. Most of us before we were monks, myself, there were periods I kept the 8 precepts, and then periods when I didn't, and I tried to keep the 5 precepts. So when you keep the 5 precepts, you have to know at the moment I'm undertaking the 5 precepts. And when you're keeping the 8 precepts, you know at the moment I'm undertaking the 8 precepts. So increasing those 3 training rules: refrain from food afternoon, refrain from indulging in entertainments, music, dancing, wearing jewelry, cosmetics, makeup and all of that, and then refraining from sleeping on a high and luxurious bed. Those 3 rules are not really, if you have kept those 8 precepts for a while, then you go back to the 5 precepts. Doesn't mean if you eat in the evening you're suddenly committing a sin, using that terminology. You're not necessarily doing something evil or wrong or bad. Maybe you work hard through the day, you're tired and you need to eat in the evening, and that's all right. It's not against the Buddhist path of practice. And the 5 precepts, you can attain stream entry keeping the 5 precepts. They're a useful vehicle for training in meditation, insight, vipassana, purifying your mind. And just because you stop keeping the 8 precepts, you don't have to feel guilty about that or feel that somehow you're indulging if you go back to sleeping on your bed, or you eat in the evening, or you have a sexual partner, that you're a sotapanna, or somebody keeping the 5 precepts can still have a partner. So you have to be clear in your mind what you're doing at what time. So whether you're keeping the 8 precepts, well, obviously you take on a much more refined level of sila. It requires more discipline, more commitment. But there'll be times when you're not keeping the 8 precepts, you're keeping the 5 precepts, and that's fine. And you shouldn't feel guilty that you're not keeping the 8 precepts. So it's about becoming mindful and fully understanding what you're doing in the practice at any one time. And particularly if you're in a position where you can go into a monastery or go on retreat and keep the 8 precepts, well, that can be a great boost to your practice because it simplifies your life during that time. It supports deepening your meditation practice. You're living in a way where you're less distracted and you've got more energy to devote to meditation. So it's very good. And to be done if you can. It's something very worthy of praise and may support your practice. But if you can't do it, you're not ready to, or your lifestyle, your life is not supportive, it doesn't matter. Keep the 5 precepts. And you don't have to feel guilty, say, if you have your food in the evening. But use the 5 precepts as the basis of behavior, and you just have to accept sometimes the 5 precepts are your vehicle, sometimes the 8 precepts. And try not to let it be a cause for self-criticism. If you might, what people tend to do is they're practicing the Dhamma and they pick up on different defilements. So say they're eating in the evening, they say, oh, I'm bad, I'm eating in the evening, I'm greedy. Well, greed may arise even if you're eating in the morning, if you're a monk or you're somebody keeping the 8 precepts. It's not necessarily the fault of keeping the precepts or not keeping the precepts, it's just that you have accumulated mental defilements through your life. And greed, anger and delusion will come out in different times. Well, it's not that the keeping the precept or not keeping the 8 precepts is the cause of that. So you have to be clear in your behavior and what you're doing. So another question. Ajahn, if there is no ahankara and mamankara, does it mean that all the fetters will fall away and no further vipaka karma? So these terms, ahankara and mamankara, they're actually not only used in Buddhism. They probably were around before the Buddha. They're used in the Hindu tradition, which is a very sort of broad tradition with many branches and many aspects to it. They come in the Sanskrit language, and Pali, the language the Buddha used, is a branch or an offshoot of Sanskrit. And they can be used or interpreted in different ways because they're used in other traditions as well. But in Buddhism they refer to ahankara as like, we call it the I-making, the concept of self. There is me, there is a self, which keeps coming up in the conditioning process of the mind. So you keep creating a self. So they call it the I-making factor or influence in the mind. Mamankara means sense of ownership, having things that belong to you. So it's mine, this is mine. So there's I and then mine. So obviously two parts of the same thing, this concept of self. Nowadays we use the word ego, which is from Latin, so it's not actually Buddhist, but it's the sense of self, which is a convenient catch-all phrase we use a lot. Perhaps another more frequently used term is upadana. So we talk about the five khandhas: body, feelings, perceptions, thought formations, sense consciousness. These five khandhas, five aggregates, are a basis for clinging, for attachment, for sense of self to arise. So that's probably a more frequently used description of self is upadana or upadana khandhas. And that's the basis for the practice of vipassana, investigating not self. And the Buddha taught not self as a kind of tool, a perception to develop to counter the habit that comes from delusion of creating a self. So to counter ahankara and mamankara. So somebody who has completed the Buddhist path, Noble Eightfold Path, they perfected it, all the different 8 factors have been perfected, completed, will no longer have a sense of self, no longer have the delusion of I or mine in their conditioning process. The mind is no longer conditioned, it's free from that, it's reached the unconditioned nibbana. So one way of describing nibbana is nibbanang paramang sunyang. Sunyang means empty, void, emptiness. So nibbana is the highest emptiness. And people always say, what does emptiness mean? Well, it means empty of ahankara, mamankara, empty of self. And the concept of self, the idea of self, and then the empty of selfish behavior, which comes from having a sense of self. So the one who's reached nibbana has no more suffering because they have no more self, no more attachment to self. So they don't attach to the khandhas, which in their nature are always bringing us dukkha, grief, trouble. There's no more attachment to them, so then the mind is liberated, free. So the only one who's really free from ahankara and mamankara, or the sense of I and mine, is the arahant, or one who's reached nibbana. And the arahant has abandoned all the fetters, the 10 fetters that bind us to the cycle of birth and death, to the world. So even the anagami, the non-returner, who is just working on the most refined kind of mental defilements prior to reaching Nibbana. They even have a subtle sense of self, a subtle level of ahankara, mamankara. They still have conceit of the most subtlest kind, they have mental agitation of the subtlest kind, because there's still some mental agitation based on, have I realized Nibbana yet or not? Or comparing with other people, maybe meet a teacher who has reached Nibbana and there's some mental comparison going on. The subtle conceit is still there. But the Arahant has abandoned all the 10 fetters, so they have no more ahankara, mamankara. So it's very central to our practice of developing wisdom and insight, this sense of self comes up all the time, and you might start, as you practice more, identifying, well, this is where my suffering comes from. The stronger the sense of self, or the sense of mine, my feeling, my thought, my this, my that, my body, and this basic sense of I is where our suffering centers. So we really do have to investigate this concept of anatta, not self, and use it as a tool. First of all, you just develop it as a perception. This is not me, this is not mine. It's a kind of reflection that you bring up to challenge the other side that's saying, this is me, this is mine, I am this. And you keep reflecting on this with mindfulness, going deeper into your consciousness and your experience of life as a human, and gradually seeing through the delusion of self by using not self as a tool. Partly this is also to counter some of the other religious traditions and teachings which say that if you abandon ahankara, mamankara, then you will reach the highest happiness, your mind will merge with God or Brahman, the great superior being. They interpret the abandoning of ahankara, mamankara still from a place of self, merging with the great self. So the Buddha had to work hard to teach anatta, partly to counter that. They say, well, no, actually, there's no great self, there's just the arising and passing away of dukkha, or the khandhas, and if one really sees that, penetrates that, then there's no more attachment. So his definition of the abandoning of ahankara, mamankara is slightly different from the Hindu or the other traditions. Last question. How do we overcome the 5 hindrances? Back to essentials. That's what we do every night on these sessions, meditation, listening to Dhamma as well, but particularly the effort you put into your meditation will be the number one way to overcome the hindrances. Cultivating sati, mindfulness, using the objects of meditation we call samatha objects. It's probably the most direct way. Recollection of the Buddha, anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing, abandoning the 5 hindrances, sensuality, or attachment to sensual desire, ill will, sloth, torpor, drowsiness, mental agitation, anxiety, restlessness, and skeptical doubt, which constantly plague us. One thing to remember is they don't just plague us and affect us during meditation, well, that's often when we really notice them. They're coming up all the time, and we're feeding the hindrances all the time through the day. When we're not mindful, we're feeding hindrances whether we realize it or not. We're picking up impressions through our eyes, ears, nose, tongue, taste, touch, and remembering all our mental impressions, sense impressions, feeding fresh rounds of hindrances to arise. And you'll notice that when you actually meditate, you have memories of pleasant experiences which stimulate desire and the desire for more pleasure and pleasant things, experiences. And then we've had unpleasant experiences, we remember, they pop up and we have negative thinking based on that. I want to get rid of them. Why do I have all these problems and suffering, blah, blah, blah. Lots of mental proliferation about past experiences, stimulating fresh desire, fresh aversion. We have anxiety over things we've said and done, maybe we regret. Things we haven't yet said and done that maybe we're considering can agitate us, bring us anxiety, fear about the future, etc., etc. All of this comes up in our meditation. If you meditate every day, you'll see the hindrances very closely at work. So you're learning how to bring up mindfulness to drop them. If your mindfulness is very strong on an object, you will drop hindrances for as long as you're maintaining mindfulness and awareness of your object. But you also need to use sometimes at least wisdom, understanding. So sometimes we also have to just sit down and reflect on things. Why am I so attached to this desirable object? Why am I getting so upset or angry about this issue? If I'm falling asleep all the time in my meditation, what can I do about it? And you have to think it through sometimes to develop strategy, understanding what's going on, what you can do about it. So sometimes we use wisdom and wise reflection to deal with hindrances. Sometimes we're just using the power of mindfulness alone. But over time, practicing regularly, you get to know the hindrances, how they come up, what their style is or the way they present themselves, and then you start developing skills in how to knock them out, how to let them go, not indulge in them. And hopefully, over time, through experience, you get better at it. And then maybe you experience, at least sometimes, when the hindrances go quiet. And that also helps you to deal with the hindrances in the future, because if you've once experienced a state of mind free from the hindrances, that really boosts your energy, your confidence. You say, oh, I know what it's like when all the chatter has gone quiet, when I am content, not desiring anything, I'm not angry, I'm not sleepy, my mind is bright, because the hindrances darken the mind. If you've experienced that, then you get a boost to your practice because you can remember it, gives you an idea of where you're going in your meditation. So don't despair. We've all had to deal with hindrances and are dealing with hindrances. It's really only the anagami and the arahant who don't have hindrances anymore. I mean, they still have the anagami still has subtle defilements, but even people who are quite experienced meditators will still experience hindrances coming up. It's just they may have the skills to quickly deal with them or effectively deal with them. So don't despair, it's just part of it, isn't it? There's always something, the next issue, the next problem to deal with. You just practice patience and keep working at it. So those are tonight's questions, and we wish you well in your practice.